Okay, it's November 6th, 2020. I am Ben Crawford, curator of the Angel Decora Museum, and I am here with Paloma Sanchez. Paloma, can you introduce yourself for everybody watching?
Yeah, so I'm Paloma Sanchez. I am an enrolled member of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. I am currently a PhD student in archaeology at UC Berkeley.
Awesome.
Do you want me to go into?
Yeah, how did you get started in that?
Yeah, so originally I had gone back to school when I was in my early 30s to get an education, and I thought I was going to go into medicine. And I thought the easiest route to do that was to be a medical anthropology major. And the requirement at the University of Washington was that you have to take an archaeology course, the intro to archaeology. So I took it, and yeah, I fell in love with it. I thought it was so interesting to be able to preserve culture, and for indigenous tribes specifically, so much has been taken away from us since colonization and continues to be hoarded in museums. And I just thought it was a really good opportunity to do something and give back to my community.
And you had mentioned earlier that although you're enrolled here in Nebraska, you often spent a lot of time in Wisconsin too, earlier in your life?
Yeah, so I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and then my Gaga lived in Black River Falls. So we spent a lot of time in Black River Falls and on the mission nearby. I'm Thunder Clan, and so our clan leader was there, and so we would go to Kigo there, but we would often go to Nebraska because we still had family there. My family is the Decora Crow family, so yeah, so we would go back for powwows, we'd visit, and just kind of travel back and forth. But most of my life was spent with the Ho-Chunk Nation and that tribe, which my mom is an enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. But my Gaga grew up on the res in Nebraska.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Now, before you started your education and your track as a PhD student, what was your understanding of things like tribal history, what NAGPRA was, what anthropology was?
Oh, I had zero information about that. So like in regards to tribal history, I had no idea. Like I didn't know any of our history during colonization, like removal. Growing up, I guess we didn't really talk about that much. And so I think that was part of the interest too. The whole reason I went back to school is I just felt like something was missing, and I wanted to reconnect with my community, my tribal community. And yeah, so I started doing all this research once I was in archaeology and decided that's what I was going to study, and became really interested and also very sad about our history and the division of our tribe. And so I just wanted to find something that would be helpful, A, for like our future generation, and B, for myself, just to feel really reconnected with our ancestors and descendant communities.
And before we go any further, for those of those who are watching, what is archaeology? I get a lot of people asking me, is that when you dig up, dinosaurs and stuff? And what is anthropology? Just for those who are unfamiliar with it.
Man, yeah. So I can't give you the firm definition now that I think about it, because it's been a while since I've done intro to archaeology. But specifically, archaeology can be a really wide field. It has nothing to do with dinosaurs. That's paleontology. But it's, yeah, so for me specifically, like I am a paleo-ethnobotanist, so I work with ancient seeds, but people could go into human remains and studying that. You can look at artifacts, pottery. People go into archaeology just to draw artifacts, which, if you're an artist, that's wonderful. People study coprolites. It just depends. It's really just about, studying the past through objects and people. And then anthropology, really, it depends. I mean, you can go into medical anthropology, and then you can go into sociocultural, but like really looking at culture and medicine and how they're kind of incorporated. And that can really be studied in contemporary time and in the past. I think archaeology is interesting these days, though, because there are more contemporary fields now. There are people that are studying things like immigration and like people coming over the border and that kind of stuff, which is really relevant now. And then there's also garbology, where people actually study garbage in contemporary time too. And so, yeah, and we talk about that all the time, about how archaeology expanding, like everything in space that's floating around, that could be an archaeological study technically, because it could be, cassettes from the 80s, but that's still in the past. So yeah, it's a really evolving kind of area, field of interest.
So yeah, I guess the big takeaway is people and stuff
Yep.
from archaeology, stuff from the past typically. Um, and as someone who's now currently studying off reservation and outside of Wisconsin, what's been that experience like for you?
It's been interesting. Yeah, I think the hardest thing for me is people telling me what indigenous culture is or what Native American should be or what they like, what's appropriate to study. I think that's like my biggest challenge is being Native and having to remind people that I'm Native and saying like, well, no, I grew up in Wisconsin. Like this is kind of what our culture is. And maybe I have a better perspective than you do because you're not a tribal member. And that can be really challenging. I think the other big challenge, and I was just doing an interview for high school students a couple weeks ago, and they were asking kind of like what the biggest challenge is about going to college and being away from your community. And it's just being away from your community. And I think the biggest thing that you can do, and what I've done since I've been at UC Berkeley, is doing outreach with all the Native students in all these different areas and coming together. And we do beading, we carve pumpkins together, and just feeling like you have somebody to talk to that understands. I think that's so important. And I think in anthropology in general, can feel really lonely because there often aren't a lot of Native scholars there. And so it's really important for me to build community because I feel like my first year when I was at Berkeley felt really lonely, not being near my tribal community, not being near anybody that I knew that was Native. Yeah, I think that's my biggest challenge.
Yeah, I've heard that when I started college in 2013, anthropology and archaeology were like the least popular majors for natives, possibly just because there hasn't been that many, and it's been very kind of, like you mentioned earlier, kind of older Caucasian guys writing the narrative. So it's kind of what you're doing is pretty new, right?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of us. And then people that do get their PhD in archaeology sometimes don't even practice archaeology. I think it's really hard and it's really sad. And like for me, studying something that is specific to your own tribe and the history of colonization can really be sad. And like you just have to feel it. And then what I'm trying to do is just trying to find a path to healing that. And I think that's the biggest problem we have in archaeology is people are not taking the time to heal those relationships of archaeologists coming and stealing items, stealing our ancestors, and then writing about us without our permission and from a very skewed point of view. So that can be really hard, but you just have to remember that it's like, I'm doing this for a really good reason and I'm going to power through and I'm going to change the field of archaeology and hopefully we'll have more Native students and even like non-Native students, teach them what it is to do ethical archaeology with tribal communities.
So speaking of energizing Native students, for a Nebraska Ho-Chunk who's in middle school or high school and they're really interested in history and archaeology, what would you have them do now and maybe look for down the line when it comes to college? What could you do as like a high schooler here to move towards that field?
Well, I mean, I will say, oh, sorry. Visiting your museum is always really a great opportunity to kind of learn about archaeology and anthropology, learning tribal history, kind of seeing those opportunities. I think, again, like my focus is collaborating with tribes. So kind of understanding what the contemporary issues are in the community. And also just doing the research. And once you do get into high school, looking for funding. I think that's the biggest thing that we don't talk about. And I will say, like, I accrued a lot of debt going to school because nobody talked to me about financial aid, about scholarships, about starting at community college first. And like, there's nothing wrong with that. Do that. Like, it's great. It's less money and you can get more one-on-one time with professors, which is great. But yeah, just kind of doing the research, I think, and just really learning about your tribe and your culture. And I think that just kind of opens a lot of doors to where you want to go next. And I think there are also a lot of internships too that you can do as a high school student in museums to kind of just get some exposure to that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I see a lot of Native specific internships at museums, and I think the National Park Service does a couple as well. Cool, cool, cool. So Now that you're in the field, what do you kind of see the future as being for archaeology if there's more native involvement?
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
know, that's a big question, so take it any way you like.
It is. I mean, I get so inspired by people like Sonia Adelaide, who I love and adore, and Amy Lone Tree, just like working on decolonizing museums. And I think the first thing is just returning items and ancestors. I think that's the biggest change. And I see so many people advocating for that and fighting for that, and returning seeds too, so we can go back to our traditional foods and grow plants. So I think that is like a huge opportunity that most people are focused on. But I also think rewriting history, like that's big for me. Like I want to make sure, like I've read so many historical things about our tribe that have been so offensive and wrong. And I just want to rewrite that. And I want to use our language to do that, because so many people will say like, oh, that's not science if it's indigenous science. And it's like, it is science and it needs to be included. So really just changing how people view us, and showing that we're still here, we exist, and we're not just static, we're dynamic. And showing that, and whether it's in museums, specifically on the tribe, I think that's important, and not in these large institutions that are just kind of, again, hoarding things and not sharing things. But I think those are a lot of big opportunities, really just like writing about us from a native perspective, and then also just returning objects and ancestors.
Yeah, I had, you mentioned it in your answer, but I was talking with somebody the other day, and they said if you did an IQ test of a Ho-Chunk person maybe 300, 400 years ago, it wouldn't look very well compared to Western standards. But when you take into account the amount of medicine and plants that people would know, it would actually be an extreme amount of intelligence and know-how when it comes to the environment. So I just wanted to kind of transition into what a little bit more of what paleo-ethnobotany is and why you got interested in that specifically.
Yeah, paleo-ethnobotany. It's a very specific field of archaeology. There are not a lot of people that study it, and it's actually a great opportunity to find a job anywhere. But really, it's about traditional foods. It makes me so angry that we were forced to like change our foodways because we were either removed, and everything was destroyed. And a lot of the times people carried their seeds with them and took them with them to the like this new land that they were meant to like habitate, and like I just thought it was so important to get back to that, because it's a way to heal the community, a community to come together to improve health on the res. Yeah, and so I just got really interested in plants, and I thought it was interesting that you can find seeds in the ground and like study them, and then maybe find seeds in a museum and they could still be viable and grown. Like I was just at a conference and they were talking about at Michigan, they had all these seeds that they were holding, and they were like, oh no, they're not going to grow, they're not going to grow. And then they built a native garden and they all grew. And it, like the science behind it, I read this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and she was just talking about how we specifically would grow corn, beans, and squash next to each other. And they would, like, scientifically, it made sense because one needed to grow high, and so it would grow around the corn, and then the squash would spread. And again, like, it's that indigenous science. Like, we knew all this time, like, a sustainable way to care for our land, and anything living on that land. And it needs to be recognized, and we need to go back to it, because right now we're ruining our environment, and like that is something that's
Monocropping and
really
stuff.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just, again, to be sovereign, I don't think, like, if we can't feed ourselves, like how can we be sovereign? And I think
Yeah.
that's important. And I think that is really what got me interested in paleoethnobotany and studying seeds specifically.
Yeah. So you mentioned briefly that there's been this big transition over the past 150, 200 years from more traditional Ho-Chunk foods and medicines to modern day foods. And I would love to talk about that if that's something that interests you.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like the commodity system and all that, right? And so like, we were moved, and then I think about too, and I haven't done the research yet to see kind of what we took with us from Wisconsin. And I mean, we were removed and placed in like 3 different places. So like to be able to grow what we used to grow in Wisconsin and then come here, and then the buffalo were all killed, like what did we do, and like how did we survive? But then like fry bread too, it's like, we've really clung on to like that as a native food, even though we didn't have anything as like lard, flour, and all like sugar and all
Yeah.
this stuff. Like that wasn't a part of our diet.
Because those were government rations, right?
Right, government rations. They normally gave us like flour, lard, coffee, tea, or not tea, and sugar. And so you kind of had to do what you could to survive. And so you
Mhm.
just like put all this stuff together and you just ate it. And now like most reservations, they have like, or not most, but like a lot of them lack access to clean water. They lack access to grocery stores that provide like just fresh produce. And a lot of it's like high sugar, high grease, like fat content. And so again, like we're
Lots of
not even
preservatives.
exactly, yeah. And so it's not healthy and it's not what we're meant to eat. Like we didn't, like our ancestors didn't eat this way. And that's why we have such high levels of like obesity and diabetes on the
Mhm.
res. And I mean, even off the res too.
Mhm. Yeah, and so there was a period of transition where because the tribe was pushed out of Wisconsin to smaller reservations, they got, like you mentioned, you said, uh, flour rations, like some salt and sugar. I've heard they might get really kind of cheap cuts of beef with like a lot of fat in it. And Also how gender went into how Ho chunks traditionally gathered plants and food, right? So that was a big swap too when it came to both gathering and eating new food, right?
Yeah, I mean, I also think about like there are a lot of tribes too that didn't gather or like mostly hunted, and then they had to, and then they really were grossed out by cows. They were
Mhm.
like, it's not, you know, all the fat and stuff, and they're like, we're not going to eat this. This is really disgusting. I was reading this actually interesting book about the Lakota and how they were forced to like they were trying to force us to be farmers, and we're
Mhm.
like, we don't. This is not our thing. Like we don't do this. This isn't our way. And eventually they were like, well, we have to survive. Like, we're starving. Like, what are we going to do with all these cows? And so they started hunting them the way that they would hunt buffalo,
Mhm.
just to kind of create it their own. And I think that's kind of, again, goes back to fry bread. Fry bread is just, how do we make this something that's ours? And even though it's not a traditional food, how can we like build that into our culture? And I thought that was really beautiful about the cows. Like they still did their ceremonies and hunted them traditionally, but in the end, like again, it wasn't a traditional food and it was really unhealthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And oh, let's see, I'm blanking here, but when it comes to that big transition, like you mentioned, where, oh, we have to farm to have food to survive. I've heard that the Blue Earth Reservation was kind of a big turning moment because the tribe was on such little amount of land that they just had to farm to make it.
Mm-hmm. But then they also like it was so good. Like they grew, I mean, they were able to prosper there. It was like really good soil. They were able to grow a ton. And then all the like surrounding white people that were living, the settlers, they were like, oh, we don't like having native people here. So like we
Mhm.
need to remove them. And it just was like it was, you know, heartbreaking because like, okay, we finally like we're close to our traditional homeland. We could farm here, even though this is not our traditional way, but we're thriving. And then it was like, oh no, you have to go. And so then they were like, okay, we're going to move you to this land where you can't grow anything. And then we were like, well, we can't survive here. And that's kind of how we ended up in Nebraska.
So I wanted to ask, and I've had to deal with this in a lot of tours, did the tribe farm before Europeans came?
No, I mean, from my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert, but we weren't really farmers. I mean, we grew things, but in a very sustainable way. And it,
Mhm.
again, it wasn't these large, like rows and rows of things and like using large animals to do that. It was in a very small way.
Mhm.
And then we also did a lot of harvesting of wild rice, which has been really interesting to read about. And then hunting, and then storing food obviously for the winter. So farming was not a big part of the way that we ate, and grew food. It was like a very small part, and it was a collective of harvesting, gathering, hunting, those kind of fishing was another big part of it too.
So pretty different from planting rows and rows and rows and rows of corn like today, and then having to stop for years because you've depleted the soil so bad that it's eroding.
Right. I mean, that's just not in general the native way, right? Like we respect the land, we respect what creator has blessed us with. And so what we try to do is, again, do it really sustainably where we know
Mhm.
we're respecting the earth and that it's going to give back to us. And in turn, like it's a reciprocal relationship. We're giving back to that, the community, like the land and its community.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a very, very different way of growing your food. And again, I think it's something that we need to go back to.
Mhm. Let's see. Oh, I had a question in mind. Oh, so what's the big thing for the future for you? Or is that kind of open, or do you have any like wish lists of, oh, I would love to do this or that?
Yeah, I think right now I'm really focused on repatriation, and specifically working with the Hearst on that at UC Berkeley.
Mhm.
Um, I think I saw sunshine on a conference and like it's so true. Like it wasn't something that I had any interest in because again, I'm a little superstitious and I think that's typically how natives roll. But like, having to handle and not knowing, I've been away from home from a really long time and I think I need to understand proper ceremony and like what I can handle and not handle,
Mhm.
and what I can be around. And I've always known that like I'm thunderclan, I can't be underground. So like my focus needs to really be not in caves and like looking at human remains. So yeah, so now I'm like more focused on that, but there's so much I need to learn and it will require spending some time with elders and with Sunshine just to kind of learn how to handle that process.
Mhm.
And then moving forward, yeah, I just want to do whatever I can to support the tribe. I mean, that's really what I keep kind of saying to Sunshine. It's like, I'm not married to anything. I think the most important part of this privilege of me getting a PhD is that we need to utilize all the resources people are throwing at me so that we can help the tribe preserve the culture, do repatriation,
Mhm.
anything that I can do to be helpful. I just want to give back to a community that has given me so much. And again, reconnect. I've been away from home from a really long time and I just like, I have this hole in my heart and I just thought that this was the best path forward to kind of fill that, and learn about my own culture. And right now I'm taking the online language course. So now I'm trying to learn our language so
Oh,
that I can
nice.
incorporate that into my research. And so, yeah, it's
Mhm.
kind of been a beautiful journey and I'm only in my second year. So I'm looking forward to the future and kind of seeing how I can support the tribe.
Mhm. Oh, that's awesome. So you mentioned earlier that one of the big problems on reservations, and even here in Winnebago, is that there's big food deserts, and you have entire populations relying on gas stations and Dollar Generals for food, and you tend to end up having all this like processed, salty, unhealthy food. How could focusing on historical plants and ethnobotany potentially change this for tribes?
Well, we can bring back traditional foods that maybe were lost because of farming, and destruction.
Mhm.
Again, it's like teaching the youth how to grow those plants too. And even if we couldn't grow the seeds, it's like a community effort to try to get back to like harvesting, and advocating that like the land is ours and like people are not respecting the treaties and that we have the knowledge to care for that land in a very sustainable way,
Mhm.
and it's hurting right now. And honestly, like I'm sure everybody knows this, but like Winona Duke is amazing to listen to, and like her farms are awesome. And she like really focuses on non-petroleum farms. So she uses horses and she has all of these native youth come to the farm, learn how to grow their own crops. So that again, we're not like focusing on these gas stations or like unhealthy foods or the things that we're getting from like federal assistant programs. It's really like, oh no, if you have a seed, and you build those relationships with your community and you trade those seeds, like look at what you can do. You can feed your family and it's in a healthy way. And again, like it's very healing because you're going back to kind of like what your ancestors did and you can really connect in that way because I think food often is like a really easy path to healing
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you have access to it. And if you don't, which we often do not, that is a major problem. And so I'm trying to fix that, in some way. And even if it means that we can only identify the seeds and can't actually grow them, it's still just having that understanding of what we used to eat, and the practices that went around it. I think that that knowledge is really helpful for our youth in the future.
Mhm. And you had mentioned somebody's name and that they had a camp for Native kids. I haven't heard about that before, and I'm sure.
Winona LaDuke, she's been around for so long. She's like I think she she went to Harvard, but like she is interesting. So she is right now focused on hemp, but she also has a farm. And so she, the hemp is just like, you can use it for fuel, you can use it for clothing. It's a super sustainable crop to grow. And so she's been really focused on that. And I know she had a project going on with the University of Washington is where I saw her in person. And then anytime she does like any talk online, I always join because it's so interesting. She has this huge farm where she just grows all traditional foods. And then she trades seeds with other tribes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And is she native?
She is native in Minnesota. I'm blanking on the tribe. But yeah, she has been a really big advocate for wild rice too, and people not stealing wild rice and patents and that kind of stuff. And so she was really active in that. But she's amazing. Yeah, she in quarantine, she said she's been stuck with a bunch of teenagers on her farm, just harvesting and growing. And I thought that was so beautiful because I think, again, it's like really focusing on our youth and like teaching them traditional ways is how we're going to preserve our culture. And I just think that's so beautiful to be able to like teach people to do that and then be so excited. Like, oh, I grew this huge squash. This is so exciting. And it's like, yeah, I love that idea. Like if I could have a farm with a bunch of kids, like native kids running around growing things, that would be my dream.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I know you kind of alluded to it in your what you said, but I think a big thing now is even though, at least on the face of it, the government isn't trying to get rid of Native culture openly. A lot of times now that there's been so much trauma, people are just kind of distracted with, video games, movies, kind of non-native stuff and non-native activities. And you'd mentioned that ethnobotany is a potential way to get back to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, just getting outside, right? And like when I grew up, we had video games and stuff, but like we still, like my parents dragged me to the mission. And it was the best time of my life being outside all the time and like picking blackberries and like, I don't know, just like playing with the dogs and all that stuff and just like being outside all the time. And so really trying to get away from that. But I will say, video games and things that are like not native, we can also like take that and like make them into educational tools. I just think we just need more people doing that kind of work to reach out to our youth as well. Like I think a lot more people have been focused on writing children's books, which is really exciting. But yeah, botany, like just growing things, kids get so excited and like they're so creative. And so when you just have like show them like this is what you do to grow something and they watch it grow and then they can eat it. I've just seen a lot of success with that with children and just getting them outside and then they just want to continue to do it.
Yeah, I heard about the culture camp last year. We didn't have one this summer here in Winnebago. They had faculty from Little Priest Tribal College here, and he did a ethnobotany walk with the kids. And they were like, "Oh, what's this plant? What's that plant? What's this plant? How do you use it?" And they were really interested. So yeah, I think that's important. Don't underestimate the ability of people to be fascinated with what's around you.
No, I think that's the whole thing with kids, right? Like they want to learn and they're so excited to learn. And sometimes I think we forget that. But yeah, I've seen camps like that too in Washington where they've taken kids out to harvest nettle and like they talk to and they learn like how like the ceremony surrounding it, they sing to nettle and then they harvest it and they learn how to harvest it again sustainably. And I think that they were always just super excited and having the time of their lives. And I just think we underestimate kids quite a bit.
And I've heard, going back to kind of getting distracted these days, that just living traditionally in Chipoteques and Ciceriches, they're not super big structures. And a lot of times, except maybe in winter, people were outside like constantly, with the exception of maybe nighttime, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what I always think about that too. Is just like, I feel so blessed to have been outside. Like we used to sleep outside all the time and like we'd go harvest plants. And I thought that was like the best thing. And then I have younger siblings who didn't get that experience as much because we were urban natives and we had moved off of our homelands. And so I felt so bad because I'm like, you missed like a huge chunk of like what was important about like how our ancestors lived. And it was just so much fun. And now, like, as an adult who's been like taken away from that for so long, that's like what I thrive for. So now, like, I'm constantly hiking all the time, camping, doing all this stuff because I just want to connect with the land again and with our ancestors. And I just, yeah, I think that's important, trying to find activities that keep you outside and learning about your culture.
Hmm. Yeah, even here in Winnebago, I think a lot of people don't know that this land wasn't necessarily what the government set aside for the tribe. The tribe worked with the Omaha to come down here and picked it out because it reminded them of Wisconsin. So unfortunately, unlike a lot of other tribes where the government drew a square and said, you're going there, the tribe picked out this land because they liked it. And so, yeah, have you had a chance to go near the river here and close to
No, I haven't. I haven't been back to the res in so long, and it makes me so sad. But now, like, again, that's, part of why I'm doing what I'm doing is to reconnect and just get back there and really learn from everybody. Because again, it's been so long, and I feel like there's so much knowledge there that I could gain because I've, been away for a long time.
Mhm. You'd mentioned earlier when they were talking about kids learning about, like, singing to the nettle and stuff and respect. I know it's kind of not quite that time of year, or not even remotely that time of year, but when spring comes around, say somebody wants to get interested, even on a micro level, in ethnobotany, what could somebody do for, like, their backyard? Should they not mow? Should they spray? Maybe they shouldn't spray if they want to encourage more native plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think chemicals are always the bad route to go. I think because it will get into water and then runs off and that kind of stuff. Yeah, honestly, that's still a learning process for me. Especially because I'm not in environmental science and I haven't taken a ton of just like botany classes. I've been more focused on just like archaeobotany. So yeah, that's going to be a learning process for me. But I actually was very inspired by our language class because there were a lot of people that were focused on like environmental science. And I thought that was really incredible to hear because I think, again, that's really important because sometimes we just take on, like, we've been assimilated. And so it's just like, okay, so how do we take a step back and say, like, oh, this is what we've been doing this whole time, but like, is it good for the land? How are we harming it? Like, how can we learn from the land? And I think that's the most important thing, like just watching what the plants are telling you, like, do they need this? Like, what do they need right now? And so I think that's like really interesting, is just like spending time outside and kind of watching plants and how they interact and how they thrive and what they need, instead of just kind of focusing on like, oh, I need to get rid of these weeds, because often what we classify as weeds were actually food or medicine. And a lot of the weeds were also brought over during colonization, but yeah, weeds are not bad. Like, you just need to listen to the plants and kind of see and learn from them. And that's been my big takeaway from all the things that I've read in my own experience. But yeah, I still need to do a lot of studying before I become really knowledgeable about that stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I've had a chance to talk with a few people here in Winnebago, and yeah, like you said, plantain, for instance. I was hanging out at the culture camp last year between activities, and someone just pointed that out, and they're like, "Hey, you can use that just like Neosporin." And I was like, "Wow, really? Everyone treats that like a weed. You got to clear that out so you get nothing but just grass in your whole lawn." And yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. I think
Now,
plantain was introduced, actually. I think that was an introduced weed from settlers, but yeah, I think we ended up finding ways to use it. And so, yeah, I think that is interesting. Like, people look at plantains and they're like, oh, so we got to get rid of it. And it's like, no, that's actually helpful medicine.
I've heard, speaking on, introduced things, is it true? I'm no expert. Were honeybees introduced from Europe too?
Oh, I don't know.
No? Okay. That's a
Yeah,
question
sorry.
for, I don't know, paleo, whatever the word is for people who study insects. I wouldn't know the scientific word.
I don't either.
So for non-natives who are interested in learning about the tribe's history, what can they do in a way that doesn't necessarily fetishize the tribe or all natives?
I mean, they have to listen. Like, I mean, that's the biggest thing, and also get permission. I think, what is it? Collaborative research is like really important, But again, I think the biggest thing for me that I've been doing a lot of readings about and what I want to focus my research on is like empowering tribes, like giving them the decision-making power over the research. You know, they should give the final say on like what are you studying, how are you studying it, and also approve all the writing that goes like that gets published. That needs to go through the tribe too. So really just giving the power to the tribes and knowing like if something cannot be shared, then we need to protect that, and that we just need to keep it with the tribe. But yeah, non-natives, I mean, that can be really challenging because again, the word archaeologist is like not fondly thought about on the res, and then you add in somebody who's not native, and then it's like, oh, I don't know if I really want to deal with you. But yeah, I think it's just really listening, and then really being committed to the time, because it is a time commitment. Like it's not going to be a fast process and be like, oh, I met you, I listened, okay, let's get into this research, like let's focus on that. It's like,
I'm an expert now. Yeah.
Exactly. Like that's not, no, these are the experts, and we're gonna weave knowledge. It's not going to be just Western science. You guys are going to have the power. And you know, if it means that it's a long-term commitment in terms of like future projects, then I'm also committed to that because I'm building this relationship. So I think that's really important. And I think that's where we get really challenged in archaeology, is people don't like relinquishing power, especially in academia. They're like, oh no, I want to be the person who writes this and tells this story, and it needs to be on my terms. And it's like, no, if you want to do really ethical work with tribal communities, then you need to take a step back.
Yeah. And that's not even touching museums if we want to talk about relinquishing stuff. Yeah, I've heard, I won't mention the specific one since this may be on YouTube, but I've heard that a major museum in the Midwest once had a policy of just trying to communicate and ask for more information from tribes during the NAGPRA process, just to drag out the process as long as possible before they would return things. And that was a stated goal, where just keep them talking until eventually they get tired and don't want the objects anymore or give up. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do in museums.
Or they'll like classify something as you know, like unknown, or like it can't be attached to a tribe because they know it's like somebody who's like not federally recognized, and so they're like, oh, you have no rights over this. Like, yeah, there's so many horror stories with museums and how they just like try to make the process so long and painful for people, or they'll get other tribes involved and say, well, this could be your object, so that they fight with each other. And it's just, yeah, it's a really messy process with museums.
I encountered one museum where we were trying to return some sacred objects back to the tribe, and the museum's response was, whoa, no. Ever since the NAC was introduced, everybody's NAC, and the traditional religion is just gone. It's just NAC now. So anything from that traditional religion you can't have back. And that was a response today. And when I was going to school, you know, not so long ago, I really thought that things would be different. You know, everything's good now in archaeology, right? But
no, yeah, it's bad. Well, and then I went to the University of Washington, where they were like dealing with the Kennewick man for years, and like that was, I mean, horrific. But I will say the Burke Museum, they just relaunched a year ago. And it's interesting how they're trying to heal those relationships. Like they made Sven Hawkinson is a curator there, and he made sure that the language is incorporated throughout the museum, that the tribes are involved in every aspect of it, that they can come and practice ceremony with their sacred objects. I think loaning programs are a huge opportunity as well. So I think there are some people out there, and he's native, so like there are native people out there doing really good work. It's just hard with those larger institutions because they definitely know how to find the loopholes in NAGPRA.
And really kind of, they are following the letter, but not necessarily the spirit of NAGPRA and what it was meant to be.
Right.
So you mentioned, you know, there's some museums that are doing their part to try and work with tribes. What should museums do? What's the way forward here? If we want to, because I'm assuming you don't necessarily want to get rid of all museums because you can't educate people about tribes, but what should they do so that they can kind of correct all this baggage from the past?
Yeah, I mean, that's been an interesting conversation over the last couple of years, is whether we need museums or not. So that's I do think like tribal museums are super important, but then like funding becomes really hard and challenging. Um, you
I
know,
know
getting
all about
objects
that.
back, that's like really hard. But the museums that are doing the work, I mean, I think first, like, so for instance, the Hearst Museum has a really bad history with especially tribes in California. And so we're starting from scratch right now. Like, I'm on the advisory board and we're trying to find ways to heal those relationships. And right now I think the first step is reaching out to tribes, letting them know that this is like our goal. Like, in our strategic plans, we are planning on working on repatriation, and that's our main focus, and this is how we're doing it. And then just having listening sessions and just saying, like, letting people kind of get that trauma and pain out and listening. And then next step is like, okay, so like, how can we help you? Whether it's, you know, as I'm in a Native student committee too, that like is trying to work with the Native Advisory Council for that museum. And so it's like, okay, so how can we be helpful? Oh, we're going to create finding aids, so it makes it easier for you to know what objects we have at that museum. And then I think the faculty director is working on fixing kind of the search element of it, like searching the archives and stuff, because they're so bad and they have some really, like, some of them, the way that they label things is really offensive. And so they're trying to clean that up too. And then I think another important part is language. We need to incorporate language in museums, like from tribes, and it needs to be, you know, with permission, obviously, but I think that's so important. And then also like showing contemporary natives is so important, because there's so many kids that still learn, especially in the East Coast, that all natives are extinct, that we've all died off.
Yeah. Or I had a group come in last winter, and their first questions to me were, do natives still ride horses and live in teepees? And it's just like, whoa, you know, sometimes if you're, yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
It's wild. Well, it's wild for me to be like being a native person. I mean, my name is Latinx, and so it's like Paloma Sánchez, and so people assume like, oh, you're, you know, Latinx, and it's like, no, but I'm native too. So like, we need to talk about this. And I'm like, and don't even get me started about the Latinx community in museums. Like, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, it's when people are like, oh, I didn't even know Native Americans were still alive, and it's like,
Jeez.
whoa, that's really disturbing. Like, that's really disturbing. And they think we live on the res in teepees and like just cook
Get
over
government money.
fires.
Yeah. That's a big one. Everybody's rich. The government is just handing out money to everybody.
Oh my God, no, like, look at what happened with COVID. Most of the tribes didn't even get their money, or if they did, it was like months after. It's
Yeah.
outrageous. Yeah, we're like, so, I mean, this is kind of like off topic, but like, I was just seeing CNN's polls on race, and we were classified as something else. Like, we're so
Okay.
invisible in this country. It is
Something
so
else.
maddening. Like, we should not be invisible. We, like, this is our land. This is where we came from. We originated from here. Like, this, it's so backwards and infuriating. And again, it's like part of the reason why I'm somewhat interested in museums is because I think it is a good opportunity. Like, so many people take field trips and stuff at museums, that we can teach about Native culture and contemporary Native culture, but there are some big steps that these museums need to take, and some funding they need to focus on that.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share? Or
No, I feel like I've been talking at you for long
oh
enough.
no, oh, it's been really, really insightful. I'm sure people are going to love to hear this.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much for allowing me to have you on. It's been a real treat, and I wish you well in your studies.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day.